Laura Bridgman was born on December 21, 1829, in Hanover, New Hampshire. By the time she was 21, the Boston Evening Transcript wrote that her name was known, quote, to a larger number of persons than that of any other female person in the world, unless we accept the Queen of England, unquote. As a baby, Laura lived on a farm in Hanover with her parents, Daniel and Harmony, and 2 older sisters. Laura had been sickly as an infant, but by the time she was 2, she was a bright, inquisitive child who spoke in sentences and had learned some letters. Just after her 2nd birthday, Laura and her sisters became ill with scarlet fever. Her sisters died, and though Laura survived, she lost her sight, hearing, and most of her sense of smell and taste. She was left with only her sense of touch. She was bedridden for the next 2 years. By the time she was 7, Laura had learned to do chores around the farm and enjoyed doing whatever her mother was doing, but she could only communicate using crude signs. That spring, James Barrett, a Dartmouth student, became acquainted with Laura while working on the Bridgman farm. He told Dr. Reuben Mussey, a Dartmouth professor, about her, and Dr. Mussey wrote an article about her. Dr. Samuel Howe, director of the Perkins Institute for the Blind in Boston, read the article, and after corresponding with both Barrett and Mussey, came to Hanover to meet Laura. Dr. Howe offered to take Laura to the Perkins Institute to try and teach her language. He reached an agreement with her parents, and on October 12, 1837, when Laura was almost 8, her parents brought Laura to the Perkins Institute.
I give tours every day at Perkins School for the Blind, and almost all of the people who visit Perkins come here because of Helen Keller. If they have heard of Helen Keller, they have also heard of Annie Sullivan, Helen's teacher, a miracle worker, who also graduated from Perkins. But almost nobody has heard of our 3rd famous student, Laura Bridgman. In a way, Laura is the most important because Laura came first. She was the first deafblind child ever to be educated. Howe brings her to Perkins. He becomes her teacher. Most experts say it is impossible to teach someone who's deafblind. And he starts by labeling almost everything in the building with raised letters embossed off the page. So the table would have the word table attached to it, chair would have chair, key would say key, spoon would say spoon. Before she touches anything in the building, he would have her touch letter by letter its name. And he discovers very quickly she's brilliant. She learns the words to go with the objects very quickly. He then raises the bar a little bit, and he cuts the words up into individual letters, mixes them up, and she's able to put them back in the right order. She knows the word that goes with each object. The next step is to take manual sign language, which is being used with the deaf, and adapt it so that instead of spelling out here where you would spell to a deaf person, he spelled into her hand. And she's able to understand the spelling words, language, and communicate that way. So she can read the raised letters, she can understand and communicate in tactile sign language. There's a sample of her handwriting here. She's able to write, and she's brilliant. When Laura attended Perkins, this is what we used to teach our children. It was called Boston Line Print. It was developed by Dr. Howe. It was embossed letters made mostly out of straight lines. What made this considered by many to be the best system of reading for the blind up until the invention of Braille, Dr. Howe had a printing press made so he can mass produce these books. Prior to this, a lot of books for the blind, going back to the 1600s, were handmade. Because they were handmade, there weren't a lot of books, and those books that existed were expensive. Because Howe has a printing press made, he can mass produce books, which makes reading for the blind available to poor as well as rich. To teach writing, because most of the embossed letters were made by a printing press, each student would have a wooden frame, and a box of metal letters that would have the letter embossed on the end that they could feel, and then they would fit the letters into this frame to form words, put a wooden block between words to form sentences, put the sentences together to form a story. This is how they learned the concept of writing, of creating their own words, sentences, stories. After they mastered this, we would then teach writing with pen and paper using all straight lines, and a writing guide like this to keep the lines straight, prevent them from writing on what they've already written. Even took into account the fact that G and Y and P go below the lines. It will go down if they need it to. And then you would just slide this down to a little groove and write your second line. Another groove, write your third line.
Laura had 3 teachers assigned specifically to her during the time she was a student at Perkins. Lydia Drew, then Mary Swift, then Sarah White. Though each left Perkins to marry, Laura kept in touch with them by letter for years. She also wrote to family members, visitors, and other people she came in contact with. She kept a journal, and she also wrote stories and poems.
How had this made in 1837? It's made out of 700 pieces of wood. But 1837, so Laura studied geography on this globe. He writes about her frequently in the Perkins annual report. She becomes famous around the country. In 1842, we have a visitor. Charles Dickens is traveling around the United States. He wants to write a book about America similar to Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America, which explained the new country to the French. Dickens wants to explain America to the British. Comes to Boston, hears about the Perkins School for the Blind, and comes to visit. Plans on staying about a half an hour, but when he sees Laura, he stays all day. He is fascinated by what this girl can do. He watches her in the classroom, he watches her sewing, he watches her interact with her friends. Through an interpreter, he asks her questions about her life. He's amazed by this young girl. 2 years later, his book, American Notes, is published. It's a very negative portrait of the United States. He's not a fan, hates slavery, doesn't particularly like our government, thinks our culture is almost non-existent. He loves Niagara Falls, but he thinks the best thing in the entire country is Laura. He writes an entire chapter about Laura Bridgman. Because he's Dickens, and everybody reads what Dickens writes, Laura becomes world famous. It is said that for many years in the 1840s and 50s, she's the second most famous woman on earth after Queen Victoria. On one day in 1844, they say 1,100 people visited Perkins to see the woman they called the eighth wonder of the world. Dr. Howe's success with Laura led to other deafblind children coming to Perkins, one of whom was Oliver Caswell. She graduates from Perkins, returns to the farm in New Hampshire, is not very happy in New Hampshire again because her parents have more children, have a farm to run. They don't have a lot of time to spend with Laura. She spends a lot of her time alone, reading a book that she brought home with her in raised letters from Perkins, and sewing, which she does love to do. But she's alone. She's lonely. She's depressed. She has no sense of taste, so when she becomes depressed, she stops eating. She eats very little. Her mother is concerned about her health, writes to Dr. Howe, telling him about her concerns, saying, Laura loves you. Is there anything you can do to help? Howe's answer is to invite Laura to return to Perkins. He gives her a room. She has people who can communicate with her in sign language, and what he thinks is the most important thing for a blind person or a deafblind person is to have a purpose in life. So he gives her a job. And she works at Perkins for the next 40 years, as a seamstress, making clothing for our students and mending their clothing. She teaches sewing to the girls, and the girls complain that she's very strict, and if you make a mistake, you need to go back and start all over again. She is still, at this point, world famous, so she has a little gift shop where she sells some things that she makes. Hand-embroidered handkerchiefs, bits of lace, doilies. She is famous for being able to thread a needle with her tongue. She actually sells needles that she threaded with her tongue as souvenirs for visitors. She stays at Perkins until death. She dies when she's 60 years old and is forgotten rather quickly because most people look at her life and what they see is a seamstress. Not a lot of famous seamstresses. What she overcame to become a seamstress is overlooked, and what's also overlooked is why she changed the world and her real importance, and that is, without Laura Bridgman, there probably would never have been a Helen Keller, or at least a famous Helen Keller, because Laura's story makes Helen's story possible. Her parents have never heard of Laura, have never heard of Perkins, and for 4 years, Helen Keller is the wild animal that you see at the beginning of The Miracle Worker. No sense of communication except to grab what she wants and strike out if you don't give it to her. And everything changes when Helen is 6, when Mother picks up a book by Charles Dickens and reads about Laura Bridgman and calls her father and says, there's a school in Boston for Helen. Helen's parents contact Perkins and ask us to send a teacher. We send Annie Sullivan, who had been a friend of Laura Bridgman's when Annie first came to Perkins. She came from the workhouse, uneducated, rude, no manners. Nobody at Perkins really liked Annie when she came here. She spent most of her first year alone, lonely. And Laura, the seamstress, hears about this new student, remembers when she was alone and lonely, and befriends Annie Sullivan. Can't have a friend you can't talk to. Laura teaches Annie sign language. Laura helps Annie with her other studies. Annie goes from the worst student in the school to the best. Is offered a job in Alabama teaching Helen Keller. Is reluctant at first to go, and Laura kind of encourages her, gives her a little push out the door. No Laura Bridgman, no Helen Keller.
Laura died on May 24th, 1889, at nearly 60 years old. She and members of her family are buried in a Hanover cemetery near the farm where she was born.